The silver Aston Martin Valkyrie AMR Pro rolled into Roderick Motors with the quiet authority of $3 million on wheels. Harper Lancaster stepped out, her tailored suit sharp against the garage's grease-stained walls. 3 senior mechanics stood around the hybrid V12 engine, shaking their heads in defeat. Nobody dared touch the ECU system without factory support. Then, a man in coveralls approached. Tall and quiet, brown hair tousled, hands still dirty from honest work. Mason Carter had been hired that morning. Harper raised an eyebrow. As the garage owner explained, this was their newest hire, a widower raising his daughter alone. Harper's laugh was cold as winter steel. "Fix this engine and I'll marry you," she said, half joking, half mocking. Everyone laughed. Mason just smiled quietly. Harper Lancaster had once believed in love the way children believe in fairy tales, with complete and trusting hearts. She had been 28 when she married Daniel Rothschild, heir to a shipping fortune, convinced that their merger of hearts would last longer than any corporate acquisition. For 3 years, she built her life around their shared dreams of expanding her family's logistics company while raising children in their Connecticut mansion. She worked 16-hour days to prove herself worthy of the Rothschild name, missing dinners and weekend retreats, always promising herself that success would buy them the time to truly connect. The betrayal came on a Tuesday evening in March. Harper had returned early from a business trip to surprise Daniel with his favorite wine and plans for a long overdue vacation. Instead, she found him in their bed with her assistant, Sarah, the woman she had trusted with her schedules, her secrets, her entire professional life. The scene burned itself into her memory with photographic clarity. Daniel's shocked face, Sarah's desperate scramble for clothes, the rumpled sheets that Harper had picked out during their honeymoon in Italy. The divorce proceedings that followed were brutal and public. Daniel's lawyers painted Harper as a cold, career-obsessed woman who had neglected her marriage. The tabloids dubbed her the Ice Queen CEO, a nickname that followed her through boardrooms and charity galas. After the settlement, Harper threw herself into Lancaster Logistics with the single-minded focus of someone who had nothing left to lose. She acquired 3 smaller companies, expanded into international shipping, and built a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Her success was undeniable, but it came at a cost. She stopped dating entirely, built walls around her heart that seemed impenetrable, and earned a reputation for being brilliant but impossibly demanding. Employees whispered that she could freeze a room with a glance, that she had never been seen to laugh genuinely, that she treated romantic prospects like hostile takeover attempts. Meanwhile, Mason Carter's story unfolded in the shadows of aerospace hangars and hospital corridors. He had been the most promising aeronautical engineer in his division at Lockheed Martin, the kind of brilliant mind that could solve problems others hadn't even identified yet. His colleagues respected his ability to see patterns in complex systems, to understand how thousands of components worked together to achieve something greater than their individual parts. Mason had married his college sweetheart, Rebecca, a pediatric nurse with gentle hands and endless patience. They had planned their life with the careful precision of an engineering blueprint. Career advancement, a house in the suburbs, children who would grow up secure and loved. Rebecca died 3 months after Lily was born, her body unable to recover from complications that the doctors said happened in less than 1% of cases. Mason held his newborn daughter in the hospital room, where his wife had just passed away, feeling as though his entire world had collapsed into a singularity of grief and responsibility. The theoretical engineering problems that had once fascinated him seemed meaningless compared to the practical challenge of keeping a tiny human alive and healthy. He took extended leave, then resigned entirely, trading his promising career for whatever work would allow him to be present for his daughter. Harper Lancaster had once believed in love the way children believe in fairy tales, with complete and trusting hearts. Mason Carter had once believed in plans the way engineers believe in mathematics, with absolute faith in predictable outcomes. Both had learned that life had no respect for such beliefs. That evening, after the garage emptied and the laughter faded, Mason remained alone with the Valkyrie. He had heard the mockery in Harper Lancaster's voice, seen the dismissive way she had looked at him, just another blue-collar worker unworthy of her attention. But Mason had also seen something else, a $3 million machine that nobody could fix, and a woman whose expensive car had become a symbol of her isolation. He approached the engine not with wounded pride, but with genuine curiosity. The Aston Martin's hybrid system was a masterpiece of engineering complexity, combining a V12 internal combustion engine with advanced electric motors, through a sophisticated energy recovery system. Most mechanics would have been intimidated by the sheer number of sensors, actuators, and control modules working in concert. Mason saw it differently. Every system, no matter how complex, was simply a collection of individual components that had to communicate with each other. The problem was usually in the communication, not the components themselves. He traced electrical pathways with the patience of someone who had once designed aircraft navigation systems, checking voltage readings and signal integrity, with tools that seemed almost primitive compared to his former aerospace equipment. The dashboard displays showed normal readings for all major systems, but the engine management computer was throwing fault codes that made no sense in combination. Mason spent 2 hours methodically checking every connection, every ground point, every wire that carried data between the engine and its electronic brain. The problem, when he finally found it, was elegantly simple. A voltage converter buried deep in the hybrid systems architecture had been installed with an incorrect ground connection. The error was so small that it hadn't triggered any obvious warning lights, but it was enough to create electrical noise that confused the engine management system into shutting down the entire powertrain. It was the kind of mistake that could happen to anyone, but finding it required the patience to check every single connection, rather than relying on diagnostic computers to identify the fault. Mason made the repair with careful precision, testing each step to ensure that his solution wouldn't create new problems elsewhere in the system. He cleared the fault codes, ran the engine through its startup sequence, and listened to the purr of perfectly balanced machinery. The Valkyrie was running better than it had since leaving the factory, but Mason didn't wake anyone to share his accomplishment. He simply cleaned his tools, washed his hands, and went home to check on his sleeping daughter. When Harper returned the next morning, expecting another day of frustration and mechanical excuses, the Aston Martin started immediately. The dashboard showed optimal performance readings across every system. She stared at the instruments in genuine surprise, then looked around the garage for an explanation. "Who fixed it?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of curiosity that hadn't been there the day before. The garage owner started to point toward Mason, but Mason caught his eye and shook his head slightly. He continued cleaning his hands with methodical attention, as if nothing unusual had happened. Harper found herself watching him with new interest, noticing the precision of his movements, the quiet confidence in the way he handled tools. For the first time in years, Harper Lancaster felt genuinely curious about another person's story. 2 weeks later, Harper found herself returning to Roderick Motors during her lunch break, ostensibly to check on some minor electrical issue that probably didn't exist. She discovered Mason sitting in a quiet corner of the garage, with a 7-year-old girl curled up against his side, her head resting on his thigh as she napped. The child was small for her age, with delicate features and skin that seemed almost translucent in the afternoon light filtering through the garage windows. "My daughter, Lily," Mason explained quietly, careful not to wake her. "School ended early today, and my babysitter had an emergency." Lily stirred at the sound of voices, opening eyes that were startlingly blue against her pale complexion. She looked at Harper with the unguarded curiosity of childhood, taking in the expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair with wonder rather than judgment. "I dreamed about you," Lily said to Harper, her voice soft but clear. "You were a princess, but you were sad because your castle was empty." Harper felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. She knelt down to bring herself to Lily's eye level, studying the child's face with growing concern. There was something fragile about Lily that went beyond her small stature, a quality that Harper recognized from painful memories of her younger brother, Michael, who had died of congenital heart disease when Harper was 22. "She has a heart condition," Mason said quietly, answering Harper's unspoken question. "Congenital cardiomyopathy. We manage it with medication and regular checkups, but it means she gets tired easily." Harper watched as Mason gently pressed his fingers against Lily's wrist, checking her pulse with the practiced ease of a parent who had learned to monitor vital signs as naturally as checking the time. The gesture was so tender, so filled with protective love, that Harper felt tears threatening for the first time in years. She had built her life around the philosophy that emotional vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford, but watching this quiet man care for his fragile daughter awakened something she thought had died with her own dreams of family. "The doctors say she might need surgery eventually," Mason continued, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying deep worry. "A heart transplant," if the medication stops working, but for now, we're managing day by day." Lily looked between the two adults, sensing the weight of their conversation even if she didn't understand all the medical terminology. "Daddy takes really good care of me," she told Harper with absolute confidence. "He knows how to fix everything that's broken." Harper spent the rest of her lunch break talking with Lily about school, about her favorite books, about the pictures she drew of imaginary worlds where everyone was healthy and happy. When it was time to leave, Harper found herself reluctant to return to the sterile efficiency of her office, to the endless meetings and strategic planning sessions that had once seemed so important. Over the following weeks, Harper developed a pattern of visiting the garage during lunch hours, always with some plausible excuse about checking on her car or asking technical questions about automotive engineering. She brought coffee for Mason and cookies for Lily, claiming she had bought too much food and didn't want it to go to waste. These small deceptions felt necessary, protecting her from having to examine too closely why she was drawn to this quiet corner of her carefully controlled world. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions about hybrid engines to more personal topics about resilience and adaptation. Mason never complained about his circumstances, never expressed bitterness about the career he had abandoned or the challenges of single parenthood. Instead, he talked about finding meaning in small victories. Lily's good days at school, a particularly challenging repair job completed successfully, the satisfaction of work that required both intellectual problem-solving and physical skill. "Don't you miss being an aeronautical engineer?" Harper asked one afternoon as they shared sandwiches while Lily played with toy cars in the corner. Mason considered the question carefully, as he seemed to consider everything. "I miss the intellectual challenges sometimes," he admitted, "but I've learned that there are different kinds of problems worth solving. Keeping Lily healthy and happy feels more important than designing aircraft navigation systems that I might never see in action." Harper found herself sharing more about her own life than she had with anyone in years. She talked about the pressure of running a family business, about the loneliness that success had brought her, about the way her failed marriage had taught her to trust numbers and contracts more than emotions and promises. Mason listened without judgment, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that helped Harper understand her own motivations more clearly. "You talk about your business like it's a fortress," he observed one day, "something that protects you from the world." "Maybe it is," Harper replied. "Maybe that's exactly what I need. Or maybe," Mason said gently, "it's become a prison instead of a fortress, and you're the only one who can unlock the door." The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. Harper had arrived at the garage to find Mason examining a spark plug under a magnifying glass, turning it slowly in the light to study its condition. She watched him work for several minutes before speaking. "You approach every problem like it's a puzzle worth solving," she said. "Even the smallest components get your full attention." Mason looked up from the spark plug, meeting her eyes directly. "I learned a long time ago that small things can cause big failures," he said. "In aerospace engineering, a tiny manufacturing defect can bring down an entire aircraft. In relationships, a small misunderstanding left unaddressed can destroy years of trust. With Lily's heart condition, a missed medication or ignored symptom could be life-threatening. So yes, I pay attention to details." Harper felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. She had spent years focusing on big strategies and major acquisitions, while ignoring the small signals that might have saved her marriage or helped her build genuine connections with other people. Her success had been built on the assumption that bigger was always better, that more control meant more security, that emotional distance was a sign of professional strength. "What if you're wrong?" she asked quietly. "What if paying attention to small things just means you're constantly worried about everything falling apart?" Mason smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Then at least when things do fall apart, you know you did everything you could to prevent it. And sometimes, when you're really paying attention, you can fix problems before they become disasters." The media storm began with a single photograph taken by Marcus Chen, an automotive blogger who made his living capturing candid moments of wealthy car enthusiasts. He had been documenting the culture around high-end auto repair shops when he spotted Harper Lancaster, one of the most recognizable CEOs in the logistics industry, sitting on a workbench at Roderick Motors, sharing what appeared to be an intimate lunch with a man in coveralls. The image itself was innocuous enough, Harper laughing at something Mason had said while Lily played with toy cars nearby. All three of them bathed in the golden afternoon light, filtering through the garage windows. But the caption Chen chose transformed the innocent scene into social media gold. Ice Queen CEO melts for blue. Collar Romeo. Harper Lancaster's secret garage romance. Within 24 hours, the photograph had been shared thousands of times across various platforms. Business journalists began speculating about Harper's personal life, with the hungry enthusiasm of entertainment reporters. The contrast between her reputation as a ruthless corporate leader and the apparent tenderness captured in the image created a narrative that seemed tailor-made for viral content. The story gained momentum when a former employee at Lancaster Logistics anonymously provided details about Harper's divorce and her subsequent romantic isolation. Suddenly, every business publication wanted to explore the human side of the woman who had been portrayed as emotionally invulnerable for years. Photographers began camping outside Roderick Motors, hoping to capture more images of the unlikely couple. Harper's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The men and women who had supported her aggressive business strategies suddenly seemed uncomfortable with her personal choices becoming public knowledge. Board chairman Robert Ashworth, a 70-year-old traditionalist who had been skeptical of Harper's leadership from the beginning, led the charge for damage control. "This kind of publicity undermines our corporate image," Ashworth declared during the emergency session. "Our clients and investors expect a certain level of professionalism from our leadership team. Dating a mechanic suggests poor judgment and questionable priorities." Harper felt the familiar chill of betrayal, the same sensation she had experienced during her divorce proceedings. The people who benefited from her success were now questioning her personal life, as if it were a business decision requiring board approval. She realized that her carefully constructed professional identity had become another kind of prison, one where even the possibility of personal happiness was seen as a threat to shareholder value. The pressure intensified when Lancaster Logistics' stock price dipped slightly in response to the media attention. Financial analysts suggested that investors were concerned about Harper's distraction from business priorities. Several major clients requested reassurance that her personal life wouldn't affect her professional performance. The whispers in boardrooms and at industry conferences painted her as a woman who had lost focus, who had allowed emotion to compromise her legendary business acumen. Harper found herself facing an impossible choice: defend her right to personal happiness or protect the company she had spent years building. The decision felt like choosing between two different versions of herself: the successful CEO who had sacrificed everything for professional achievement, and the woman who had recently rediscovered the possibility of genuine human connection. The press conference was scheduled for a Friday morning at Lancaster Logistics corporate headquarters. Harper stood behind the podium in her most authoritative business suit, looking directly into the cameras with the cold confidence that had made her famous. The assembled journalists expected either a romantic confession or a dramatic denial, something that would provide content for another news cycle. Instead, Harper delivered a masterclass in professional damage control. "The recent media attention regarding my personal life has been based on speculation and misinterpretation," she said, her voice carrying no trace of emotion. "I have no romantic relationship with any employee of Roderick Motors. The photographs in question captured a business discussion about automotive maintenance, nothing more. I would appreciate if the media would focus on Lancaster Logistics' record-breaking quarterly performance, rather than creating fictional narratives about my private life." Mason watched the press conference from the garage's small office, Lily asleep in his arms after another difficult day at school. He saw the familiar mask slip over Harper's features, watched her transform back into the untouchable CEO who had first mocked him weeks earlier. He felt no anger at her denial, only a deep sadness for the woman who had briefly allowed herself to be vulnerable and was now retreating behind corporate armor to protect what she thought mattered most. The next morning, Mason submitted his resignation to Roderick Motors without fanfare or explanation. He left no forwarding address, no message for Harper, no dramatic gesture that might create more media attention. He simply collected his tools, kissed Lily goodbye as she headed to school, and disappeared from Harper's carefully ordered world as quietly as he had entered it. Harper returned to the garage 3 days later, expecting to find Mason at his usual workstation. Instead, she found only an empty corner where his toolbox used to sit and the lingering scent of engine oil and honest work. The garage owner explained Mason's departure with obvious regret, mentioning that he had been their best mechanic despite working there for such a short time. For the first time since her divorce, Harper Lancaster felt truly alone. Her stock price had recovered, the media attention had moved on to other stories, and her board of directors had praised her handling of the crisis. She had successfully protected her professional reputation and maintained her image as an uncompromising business leader. But success felt hollow when measured against the absence of Mason's quiet presence and Lily's innocent laughter. Harper threw herself back into work with desperate intensity, staying late every night to review quarterly reports and strategic plans that suddenly seemed meaningless. She attended board meetings and industry conferences, where colleagues congratulated her on weathering the media storm, their approval feeling like consolation prizes for a game she wasn't sure she wanted to win. 3 weeks after Mason's departure, Harper received a phone call that changed everything. The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the pediatric cardiologist at Children's Hospital, calling to inform Harper that Lily Carter had been admitted for emergency surgery. Mason had apparently listed Harper as an emergency contact, a detail that surprised both the doctor and Harper herself. Her condition has deteriorated rapidly, Dr. Mitchell explained. She needs immediate valve replacement surgery, but there are complications with insurance approval and payment arrangements. The father seems to be handling everything alone, and frankly, he appears to be under tremendous stress. Harper drove to the hospital without thinking about the implications for her carefully protected public image. She found Mason in the cardiac intensive care unit's waiting room, slumped in a plastic chair with his head in his hands, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. Technical drawings were scattered on the floor around his feet, sketches of what appeared to be a mechanical heart valve design that he had been working on during the long hours of waiting. When Mason looked up and saw her, his expression showed no surprise, only gratitude mixed with the bone-deep weariness of a parent facing every father's worst nightmare. Harper sat down beside him without speaking, her presence offering the only comfort she knew how to give. They waited together in the sterile hospital corridor, two people who had built walls around their hearts, now united by concern for a 7-year-old girl who had shown them both what love without conditions looked like. "I should have stayed in aerospace engineering," Mason said quietly, more to himself than to Harper. "The insurance would have been better, the salary higher. Maybe I could have afforded better preventive care. Maybe we would have caught this sooner." Harper took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of honest work, the slight tremor of exhaustion and fear. "You gave her something more valuable than money," she said. "You gave her a father who was present for every day, who knew her well enough to notice when something was wrong, who loved her enough to sacrifice his own ambitions for her well-being." The surgery lasted 6 hours. During that time, Harper quietly arranged for the hospital's best pediatric cardiac surgeon to join the team, ensured that all experimental treatments would be covered regardless of insurance limitations, and established a trust fund that would guarantee Lily's future medical care. She did all of this without consulting Mason, without seeking recognition or gratitude, simply because it was the right thing to do for a child who had taught her that dreams were worth believing in. When Dr. Mitchell emerged from the operating room with news of the surgery's success, Mason wept with relief while Harper held his shoulders, feeling her own tears fall for the first time in years. Lily would recover fully, the surgeon explained, though she would need ongoing care and regular checkups for the rest of her life. That night, as Lily slept peacefully in her hospital bed, surrounded by monitors that showed a steady, strong heartbeat, Harper and Mason talked about second chances and the courage required to rebuild a life from broken pieces. Neither of them mentioned the media storm that had driven them apart, focusing instead on the future they might create together if they were brave enough to try. "I'm not the same person who made that joke in your garage," Harper said as dawn light began filtering through the hospital windows. "That woman was afraid of everything that mattered. I don't want to be afraid anymore." Mason looked at her with eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. "We're all afraid of something," he said. "The question is whether we let fear make our decisions for us, or whether we choose to act despite being afraid." Harper realized that she had spent years building her identity around professional achievements that felt empty compared to the simple act of holding vigil beside a child's hospital bed. Success without connection was just elaborate loneliness, and all the money in the world couldn't buy the sense of purpose she had found in caring about Mason and Lily's well-being. 6 months after Lily's surgery, Harper Lancaster made an announcement that shocked the business world. She was stepping down as CEO of Lancaster Logistics to pursue new opportunities in vocational education and small business development. The decision cost her millions in stock options and executive compensation, but it gave her something she had never possessed: the freedom to build a life based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. Harper and Mason opened Phoenix Garage together, a combination auto repair shop and technical training center located in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. Their mission was simple but revolutionary: provide high-quality automotive education to people who had been written off by traditional career paths, creating opportunities for ex-convicts, high school dropouts, and anyone else who needed a second chance. Mason designed the curriculum while Harper handled business operations and community outreach. They hired instructors who combined technical expertise with genuine care for their students, creating an environment where learning happened through mentorship rather than judgment. The garage quickly developed a reputation for excellent work and fair prices, while the training program began graduating skilled technicians who went on to successful careers throughout the region. Harper discovered that she was better at teaching business principles to eager students than she had ever been at impressing board members with quarterly projections. She found genuine satisfaction in watching former addicts rebuild their lives through honest work, in seeing teenage mothers gain financial independence through skilled trades, in creating pathways to stability for people who had been told they were failures. The transformation wasn't easy. Harper had to learn how to work with her hands, how to diagnose engine problems through sound and feel rather than computer analysis, how to communicate with students who came from vastly different backgrounds than her own privileged upbringing. But every challenge taught her something new about resilience, about the dignity found in all honest work, about the strength that comes from helping others succeed. Mason watched Harper's evolution with quiet amazement. The woman who had once mocked his blue-collar work now spent her days teaching young people to take pride in technical skills, to see mechanical aptitude as a form of intelligence worth developing. She had traded her designer suits for practical work clothes, her corner office for a classroom that smelled of motor oil and possibility. Lily thrived in the environment they created together. Her heart condition still required careful monitoring, but she had grown stronger and more confident as she watched the two most important adults in her life build something meaningful from broken pieces. She became the unofficial mascot of Phoenix Garage, charming students and customers with her intelligence and warmth, reminding everyone that love could heal more than just broken engines. 1 year after opening Phoenix Garage, Harper decided it was time to acknowledge publicly what had been obvious to everyone who knew them. She and Mason had built more than just a successful business together. The occasion was their first anniversary celebration, a community gathering that brought together their students, customers, and friends for an evening of recognition and gratitude. Harper took the microphone during the dinner program, holding a small wrapped package that she had been carrying for weeks while gathering the courage to make her intentions clear. The room fell silent as she unwrapped an old spark plug from her Aston Martin Valkyrie, now polished to a silver shine and mounted on a small wooden base. "A year ago," Harper began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I made a joke to a man I barely knew. I said if he could fix my engine, I would marry him. I thought I was being clever, maybe a little cruel, definitely superior to someone I saw as beneath my notice." She turned to face Mason, who was sitting at the head table with Lily beside him, both of them watching her with expressions of love and anticipation. "What I didn't understand then was that he didn't just fix my car," Harper continued. "He fixed something in me that I didn't even realize was broken. He showed me that real strength isn't about controlling other people or building walls around your heart. Real strength is about showing up for the people you love, day after day, whether it's glamorous or not." Harper approached Mason's table, holding out the mounted spark plug like an offering. "So I'm not joking this time when I say, you fixed my engine, Mason Carter. You fixed my heart. You fixed my understanding of what matters in life. And you fixed my faith in the possibility that two broken people can build something beautiful together." Mason stood to accept the gift, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box containing a ring that Lily had designed. A simple silver band, inlaid with tiny gears and springs, a piece of jewelry that looked like it had been crafted by someone who understood that the most beautiful things are also the most functional. "I love you, Harper Lancaster," Mason said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I love your intelligence, your ambition, your capacity for growth, and your willingness to get your hands dirty for the people you care about. I love the way you've learned to see beauty in ordinary work, and the way you've taught me that it's possible to dream again without forgetting the lessons that loss has taught us." The proposal that followed was witnessed by 200 people who had found hope and opportunity at Phoenix Garage, a community that understood the value of second chances and the courage required to rebuild a life from broken pieces. When Harper said yes, the celebration that erupted was genuine and joyful, a recognition that love stories don't always follow predictable patterns, and that the best endings often begin with someone brave enough to fix what seems irreparable. 2 years later, the Lancaster Carter family lived in a comfortable house within walking distance of Phoenix Garage, their daily routines shaped by the rhythms of work, school, and the quiet satisfaction of building something lasting together. The Aston Martin Valkyrie sat in their driveway, now decorated with a small decal that read, "Fixed with Love," a reminder of the joke that had become a promise, and the promise that had become a life. Harper had learned to find joy in small victories, a struggling student mastering a difficult repair, a customer whose car troubles were solved with patience and skill, a daughter who grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. Mason had discovered that there were many ways to be an engineer, that solving human problems could be just as intellectually satisfying as designing aircraft navigation systems. Lily, now 9 years old and healthy, served as the bridge between her parents' different worlds, equally comfortable discussing business strategy with Harper and engine diagnostics with Mason. She had inherited her father's mechanical aptitude and her stepmother's strategic thinking. But more importantly, she had learned from both of them that love was something you chose to practice every day, not just something that happened to you. On quiet Sunday mornings, when Phoenix Garage was closed and the family had time to themselves, Harper would sometimes sit in the Valkyrie and remember the woman she used to be. Successful but isolated, protected but lonely, powerful but ultimately powerless. To create the connections that gave life meaning. The transformation had cost her millions of dollars and forced her to abandon an identity she had spent years building. But it had given her something infinitely more valuable, a family built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the daily choice to fix what was broken rather than discard what seemed damaged beyond repair. The spark plug that had started everything sat on their mantelpiece, polished and proud, a symbol of the truth that the smallest components can sometimes power the most important transformations. Harper Lancaster had learned that engines aren't the only things that can be fixed with patience, skill, and love. Sometimes broken hearts just need the right mechanic, someone willing to trace every connection until they find the source of the problem, someone patient enough to make repairs that will last a lifetime. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the 9th floor of Henderson Media Tower. Evelyn Hartman stepped out, her heels clicking against the polished marble as she headed toward her corner office. At 35, she commanded respect in every boardroom she entered, her sharp intellect matched only by her unwavering determination. But today, something unusual caught her eye. A man in custodial uniform standing before the old piano that had been gathering dust in the lobby for months. He wasn't cleaning it. He was simply staring, his weathered hands hovering inches from the keys, as if they held some forbidden secret. Evelyn paused, crossing her arms with an amused smile playing at her lips. "If you can play Chopin," she called out, her voice carrying across the empty space. "I'll marry you." The words escaped before she could stop them, half joke, half challenge. She had no idea she had just opened a door that would change everything. The man who turned to face her carried stories in his eyes that most people his age had never lived. Daniel Carter, 40 years old, had once been destined for concert halls and standing ovations. His fingers had danced across ivory keys in ways that made audiences weep, his interpretation of Chopin's nocturnes earning him invitations to perform at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. The music critics of the early 2000s had called him a poet of the piano, predicting a career that would span decades and inspire generations. But that was before life rewrote his symphony in a minor key. Before Sarah's cancer diagnosis at 28, when the world suddenly became about chemotherapy schedules instead of concert dates. Before he chose love over fame, staying by her hospital bed instead of boarding a plane to Paris for what would have been his European debut. Sarah had been more than his wife. She had been his first audience, his most honest critic, and his greatest source of inspiration. They had met at Juilliard, two young musicians convinced they could change the world through art. She played violin with a technical precision that complemented his emotional interpretation of the classics. And together, They had dreamed of performing as a duo in the great halls of Europe. But cancer had stolen those dreams one cell at a time, leaving Daniel to watch the woman he loved fade away while their newborn daughter slept peacefully in a hospital bassinet, unaware that her world was already breaking apart. After Sarah's death, Daniel had tried to continue performing, believing that music could somehow heal the gaping wound in his chest. But every note felt hollow, every performance a betrayal of the joy they had once shared. The final blow came 3 years later, when a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything again. Lena survived the crash, but the head trauma had stolen her hearing, plunging her into a world of silence at the age when most children were learning to sing nursery rhymes. In that hospital room, watching his daughter struggle to understand why the world had suddenly gone quiet, Daniel made a decision that would define the next 7 years of his life. He would put away his music and focus entirely on being the father Lena needed, learning sign language and advocacy, and how to navigate systems designed for hearing children. The custodial job at Henderson Media Tower was not what Daniel Carter had imagined for his 40s, but it provided steady income and health insurance, two things that mattered more than artistic fulfillment when you were raising a child with special needs. His coworkers knew him as quiet and reliable, never suspecting that the man who cleaned their offices had once received standing ovations from audiences of thousands. Evelyn's world existed 30 floors above the streets, where Daniel raised his daughter, in a penthouse office that overlooked Manhattan like a throne room. Henderson Media Tower was her empire, built through calculated risks and 18-hour workdays that had paid off beyond her wildest expectations. She had started as an intern fresh out of business school, armed with nothing but ambition and a willingness to outwork everyone around her. 20 years later, she controlled a media conglomerate worth billions, her decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of consumers worldwide. The view from her office encompassed Central Park and the Hudson River, a daily reminder of how far she had climbed from her middle-class origins in suburban Connecticut. But success had come at a cost that Evelyn was only beginning to understand. Her relationships were professional rather than personal. Her conversations focused on profit margins and market share instead of hopes and dreams. The penthouse apartment she called home was featured in architectural magazines, its minimalist design and expensive furnishings creating spaces that were beautiful but cold. She ate dinner alone most nights, scrolling through reports on her tablet while picking at salads from restaurants where celebrities dined and photographers waited outside. Music had once been Evelyn's escape from the pressures of academic achievement and parental expectations. During her teenage years, she had spent countless hours at the family piano, losing herself in Chopin's nocturnes and Debussy's impressionist landscapes. Her technique had been good enough to earn admission to Juilliard's pre-college program, where she studied alongside other gifted young musicians who dreamed of careers on stage. But her parents, both successful lawyers, had viewed music as an expensive hobby rather than a viable profession. They had pushed her toward business school, arguing that art was a luxury she couldn't afford and that financial security should take priority over creative fulfillment. Now, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success, Evelyn wondered if she had made the right choice. If the music she had abandoned might have led to a different kind of happiness. The silence in her life wasn't the comfortable quiet of contentment. It was the hollow echo of a woman who had achieved everything she thought she wanted, only to discover that success without connection felt remarkably like failure. The old piano on the 9th floor had been a fixture of the building since its construction in the 1980s, a remnant from the previous owner who had believed that corporate spaces should include touches of culture and beauty. Most employees walked past it without a second glance, treating it as expensive furniture rather than a musical instrument. But Daniel found himself drawn to it during his nightly rounds, remembering the weight of keys beneath his fingers and the way music could transform time and space. Several nights passed before Daniel encountered the piano again. This time, it had been tuned, its keys gleaming under the lobby's recessed lighting. A maintenance worker mentioned that Miss Prostant, Hartman had personally requested the restoration, though no one understood why. "She came down here herself to check on the work," the man explained, polishing the bench with careful attention to detail. "Said something about wanting it to be concert-ready, in case anyone with real talent ever decided to play it. Seemed to think it was important that everything be perfect." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, memories flooding back of Sarah listening to him practice. Her eyes closed in pure contentment as his fingers found the emotional core of each piece. That evening, Daniel found himself lingering longer than usual in the 9th-floor lobby, his cleaning supplies forgotten. As he stood before the restored instrument, the building was empty, except for security guards making their rounds, and the occasional executive working late into the night. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of years pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought about Evelyn's challenge, wondering if she had been serious or simply making conversation with someone she assumed was just part of the building's invisible workforce. Either way, something inside him was awakening after years of dormancy, a hunger that had been buried beneath responsibility and grief, but never truly extinguished. When he finally returned home that morning, the sun was already painting the Queen's skyline in shades of gold and pink. Lena was awake early, as she often was, sitting at their small kitchen table with her sketchbook and a box of colored pencils that Mrs. Rodriguez had given her for her last birthday. She looked up as he entered, her expressive eyes studying his face with the intuitive wisdom that children often possess. Her hands moved in the fluid gestures of sign language, asking why he looked different today, why his eyes seemed to be holding secrets. "Daddy looks like he's remembering something beautiful," she signed, tilting her head with curiosity. "Your face has music in it again." The observation caught him off guard, reminding him once again that his daughter saw the world with an artist's eye, noticing details that adults often missed in their rush through daily life. The community center 3 blocks from Daniel's apartment building had seen better days, its brick facade weathered by decades of New York winters, and its interior spaces worn by countless meetings and events. But in the basement, past the storage rooms, filled with folding chairs and seasonal decorations, sat an old upright piano that had been donated by a church during the 1990s. The instrument was terribly out of tune, several keys stuck from humidity damage, and the pedals squeaked with each use, but it was functional enough for someone desperate to make music again. The night janitor, a kind man named Miguel who had worked there for 15 years, had given Daniel a key in exchange for covering a few of his shifts during particularly busy weeks. For 2 weeks, Daniel had been making these pilgrimages after his shift at the tower, slipping into the quiet basement and approaching the piano like a penitent, returning to an abandoned altar. His first attempts were humbling, his fingers stumbling over passages that had once flowed like water from his memory. Muscle memory warred with mental blocks, technique fighting against emotion, as he worked through scales and arpeggios that felt foreign after years of neglect. But gradually, something began to shift. The piano responded to his touch despite its flaws, and he found himself remembering not just the notes, but the feelings that had once made him a compelling performer. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major had been Sarah's favorite piece, the music he had played during their wedding ceremony while she walked down the aisle in her grandmother's dress. Now he worked through it measure by measure, rebuilding not just his technical ability but his emotional connection to a part of himself he thought had died with her. Each practice session became a dialogue with his past, a negotiation between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, between the dreams he had abandoned and the possibilities that might still exist. Lena had begun following him to these late-night sessions, curling up on a folding chair with her sketchbook while he worked through his repertoire. She couldn't hear the music in the traditional sense, but she could feel the vibrations through the floor, could see the emotion in his posture as he played. Her drawings from these evenings were extraordinary abstract compositions of color and movement that somehow captured the essence of music without sound. Blues and purples swirled across her pages when he played Chopin's more melancholic pieces, while bright yellows and oranges danced during the lighter passages. She was creating her own language for music, translating sound into visual poetry, with an instinct that amazed her father. One night, as he finished a particularly difficult passage that had been giving him trouble for days, Lena approached the piano and placed her small hands on its wooden case. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she felt the instrument's vibrations travel through her palms and up her arms, her face lighting up with discovery. Through sign language, she told him that she could feel the music in her chest, that it made colors appear behind her closed eyelids, like fireworks on the 4th of July. "I can't hear it the way other people do, Daddy," she signed, tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I can feel your heart in every note." The transformation in Daniel's demeanor didn't go unnoticed by the sharp eyes that had built a media empire from nothing. Evelyn had initially forgotten about her impulsive challenge to the custodian, chalking it up to a moment of whimsy in an otherwise carefully structured life. But she found herself paying attention to the building's invisible workforce in ways she never had before, particularly the quiet man who seemed to approach the 9th-floor piano with something approaching reverence. There was something in his posture when he stood before the instrument, the way his hands moved even when he wasn't touching the keys, that suggested familiarity beyond casual interest. He moved like someone who understood music from the inside out, who had spent years learning to coax emotion from ivory and ebony. One evening, working late on quarterly reports that would determine the company's direction for the next fiscal year, Evelyn heard something that made her pause mid-sentence. Music was drifting through the building's ventilation system, faint but unmistakable. It was Chopin, played with a technique that was slightly rusty around the edges, but emotionally devastating in its honesty. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere below, and following it led her to a conference room on the 7th floor that faced the street. Through the window, she could see the community center across the way, where a figure was hunched over an old piano in a basement room, his silhouette barely visible through the grimy glass. Even from that distance, even without being able to see his face clearly, she knew it was him. There was something about the way he held himself at the keyboard, the particular tilt of his head, when he concentrated on difficult passages, that confirmed her suspicion. Evelyn found herself returning to that conference room each night thereafter, listening to his practice sessions like a secret she couldn't share with anyone else. The music he played wasn't perfect. There were missed notes, hesitations, moments where emotion seemed to overwhelm technique, but it was alive in ways that polished concert recordings never managed to capture. It spoke of loss and hope, of love that transcended death, of beauty that could exist even in broken things and wounded hearts. Curiosity eventually overcame professional boundaries, leading Evelyn to ask her assistant to research the building's custodial staff. What she discovered about Daniel Carter kept her awake for 3 nights straight, her mind reeling with implications she hadn't expected. He had been magnificent once, a rising star whose career trajectory had pointed toward the highest levels of classical performance. Old reviews described his playing as transcendent and emotionally fearless, while photographs from his concert days showed a younger man whose entire being seemed to glow with artistic purpose. Articles from the early 2000s detailed his rapid ascent through the classical music world, his engagement to fellow musician Sarah Brennan, and their plans to tour Europe as a piano-violin duo. But somewhere around 2006, the coverage had simply stopped. Daniel Carter had vanished from the concert circuit as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only questions and speculation about what might have derailed such a promising career. The last article Evelyn could find was a brief mention in a classical music journal about the cancellation of his European tour due to personal circumstances. But no further details were provided. She spent an entire weekend watching grainy YouTube videos of his performances, studying his face for clues about the man he had been before life had reshaped him into someone who cleaned office buildings for a living. What struck her most about those old performances was the pure joy that radiated from his entire being when he played. His face would transform the moment his fingers touched the keys, years seeming to fall away as he surrendered completely to the music flowing through him. There was no self-consciousness in his performance, no awareness of the audience or the cameras, or the critical eyes watching his every move. He played as if the music was a language he had been born speaking, as if the piano was simply an extension of his soul rather than an external instrument requiring technical mastery. Watching him play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Evelyn found herself crying for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, moved by the obvious love affair between this man and his art. "Why did you stop?" she whispered to the computer screen, though she was beginning to understand that the answer was probably more heartbreaking than she was prepared to handle. The revelation about Daniel's true identity changed everything for Evelyn, adding layers of complexity to what had begun as a simple workplace interaction. She began learning American Sign Language using online tutorials and mobile apps, practicing during lunch breaks and memorizing basic conversations that might be useful if she ever met his daughter. The learning process was humbling for someone accustomed to mastering new skills quickly, but she persevered with a determination that surprised even her. When she finally encountered Daniel and Lena in the building's lobby the following week, she was able to sign a simple greeting to the little girl, whose face immediately lit up with surprise and delight at finding someone new who could communicate in her language. Daniel's shock was even more pronounced than his daughter's joy. Here was his employer, this powerful woman in her expensive designer suit and Italian leather shoes, taking the time to learn sign language and engage with his daughter as an equal rather than an object of pity. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to suppress. But Evelyn could see the gratitude in his eyes, could read the story of countless interactions where well-meaning people had either ignored Lena entirely or spoken about her as if she wasn't present. "Yes, I did," Evelyn replied, watching Lena sign enthusiastically about her latest drawing project for school. Everyone deserves to be heard, regardless of how they communicate. What began as occasional encounters in the lobby gradually evolved into something neither of them had expected or planned. Evelyn found herself creating reasons to work late, timing her departures to coincide with Daniel's arrival for his evening shift. Their conversations were initially brief and professional discussions about building maintenance, weather patterns, or general observations about city life, but gradually deepened as trust developed between them, like a slowly blooming flower. Lena became the bridge that connected their vastly different worlds, her innocent questions and unfiltered observations breaking down the artificial barriers that separated a corporate executive from a night janitor. The little girl would show Evelyn her artwork with the pride of someone sharing precious treasures, elaborate scenes of families and music and dreams rendered in crayon and colored pencil that revealed a sophisticated understanding of emotion and relationship. Each drawing was a window into her silent but vibrant inner world, populated by characters who communicated through gesture and expression rather than spoken words. Evelyn found herself looking forward to these impromptu art exhibitions more than board meetings or client presentations, touched by Lena's ability to find beauty and story in everyday experiences that most adults overlooked in their rush through busy schedules. During one of these lobby conversations, Lena asked Evelyn why she looked sad sometimes, her small hands forming the question with a directness that caught the CEO off guard. Through Daniel's translation, the child explained that she could see sadness in people's faces even when they were smiling, that Evelyn carried a particular kind of loneliness that reminded her of her father during his worst periods of grief. The evening, Evelyn invited Daniel and Lena to her corner office marked a turning point that none of them could have predicted. Her executive suite contained amenities that most people only saw in magazine spreads: imported furniture, original artwork, and a view of Manhattan that seemed to stretch on forever. But the centerpiece of the room was something she had inherited from the building's previous owner and never bothered to remove. A baby grand piano that sat in the corner like an expensive piece of furniture, its polished black surface reflecting the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. She had walked past it thousands of times without giving it a second thought. But tonight, it seemed to pulse with possibility. "I thought maybe," she began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of what she was suggesting. The power dynamics were complicated. She was, after all, his employer, and any gesture could be misinterpreted as either charity or manipulation. "Would you play something? For Lena?" The request hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple entertainment. Daniel approached the instrument with the reverence of someone returning to a sacred space after years of exile, his weathered hands finding the keys as if greeting old friends who had been waiting patiently for his return. When he began Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece he had been practicing obsessively in the community center basement, the sterile corporate environment transformed into something magical and alive. Lena positioned herself beside the piano bench, her small hands pressed against the instrument's wooden case to feel every vibration that traveled through its frame. Evelyn found herself remembering her own childhood, hours spent at her family's upright piano before practical concerns and parental pressure had redirected her path toward business school and corporate success. As Daniel played, she began unconsciously tapping out the melody's rhythm on her desktop, an unconscious echo of the way her mother used to conduct, along with classical radio programs during Sunday afternoon cleaning sessions. The three of them existed in that moment outside of normal time, connected by music that transcended the barriers of hearing impairment and social class and professional hierarchy. When the last note faded into the ambient hum of the building's heating system, they sat in comfortable silence, each processing what had just occurred in their own way. The idea for what would become the Tactile concert series came to Evelyn during a sleepless night several weeks later, her mind churning with possibilities she had never considered before, discovering this hidden corner of Daniel's world. Henderson Media Tower had a small auditorium on the third floor that was primarily used for product launches and investor presentations, equipped with a sophisticated sound system that could be modified to emphasize vibration and bass frequencies. She began researching programs for deaf and hard-of-hearing audiences, reaching out to music therapists and educators who specialized in making live performances accessible to people who experience sound differently than the general population. The response to her inquiries was overwhelming and educational in equal measure. Apparently, very few venues offered tactile music experiences, and the waiting lists for existing programs were extensive, sometimes stretching months into the future. Parents of deaf children described the frustration of wanting to share their love of music with offspring who couldn't access it through traditional means, while educators explained the therapeutic and developmental benefits of exposing hearing-impaired individuals to rhythm and vibration. Within 3 weeks, Evelyn had organized an evening specifically designed for deaf and hard-of-hearing children and their families, working with specialists to modify the auditorium's acoustics and seating arrangements to maximize the physical sensation of musical performance. Daniel initially resisted the idea of performing publicly, his confidence still fragile after years away from the stage and the pressures of professional scrutiny. But Lena's excitement about the prospect of sharing her unique way of experiencing music with other children ultimately convinced him to participate. He spent 2 weeks carefully selecting a program that would translate well to tactile appreciation pieces with strong rhythmic elements and emotional clarity that could be felt as easily as heard. The repertoire ranged from Chopin's most accessible nocturnes to contemporary compositions written specifically for mixed audiences of hearing and deaf listeners, each piece chosen for its ability to communicate through vibration and visual performance, as much as auditory beauty. The evening of the first tactile concert, 30 families filled the modified auditorium with an energy unlike anything Evelyn had ever experienced in a corporate setting. Children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers sat on specially designed mats near the stage, their hands pressed against the wooden platform to feel every note that emerged from the piano. Parents watched their children's faces with expressions of wonder and gratitude, many seeing their offspring engage with music for the first time in their lives. The atmosphere was intimate and expectant, filled with a kind of anticipation that had nothing to do with critical judgment and everything to do with the pure joy of shared discovery. Lena sat in the front row with her sketchbook and a fresh box of 64 colored pencils, ready to capture the colors and shapes that music created in her synesthetic imagination. As Daniel began his first piece, a gentle interpretation of Chopin's Minute Waltz, she immediately began drawing, her hand moving across the paper in fluid motions that seemed to mirror the music's rhythm and emotional flow. Other children watched her work with fascination, some attempting their own artistic interpretations of what they were feeling through their palms and bodies. The concert became a multimedia experience, combining auditory, tactile, and visual elements in ways that transcended traditional performance boundaries. As Daniel progressed through his carefully curated program, Evelyn found herself positioned at the back of the auditorium, tears streaming down her face as she watched magic unfold before her eyes. This wasn't about perfect technique or critical acclaim or career advancement. This was about connection in its purest form, about art serving its highest purpose, by bringing joy and understanding to people who needed it most. When Daniel finished his final piece, a contemporary composition that incorporated percussion elements the children could feel through the floor, the audience's appreciation was expressed not through traditional applause, but through raised hands waving in the deaf community's visual equivalent of clapping, a silent symphony of gratitude that was more moving than any standing ovation she had ever witnessed. In the quiet aftermath of the concert, as families departed and the auditorium slowly returned to its usual corporate neutrality, Evelyn found herself alone with Daniel and Lena in the space where something extraordinary had just occurred. The little girl had fallen asleep in her father's arms, exhausted by the evening's emotional intensity, but clutching her sketchbook filled with colorful interpretations of the music she had experienced through touch and vibration. Her drawings were extraordinary abstract compositions that somehow captured the essence of each piece Daniel had played, translating sound into visual poetry with an instinctive understanding that amazed the adults who studied her work. About what I said that first day, Evelyn began, her voice barely above a whisper in the dimmed auditorium. About marrying whoever could play Chopin. Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, his arms cradling his sleeping daughter, while his eyes searched her face for clues about where this conversation might lead. The words she had spoken months earlier as a casual joke now carried weight neither of them had anticipated, loaded with implications that went far beyond musical ability or professional hierarchy. "I think I was looking for something I didn't know how to name," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she found the courage to speak honestly about feelings she was still learning to understand. "I thought it was about the music, about finding someone who could play Chopin because that represented sophistication or culture or some kind of artistic validation I felt I was missing from my life. But it wasn't about that at all. It was about finding someone who understood that some things are more important than perfection, someone who could see beauty in broken things and wounded hearts, someone who knew that the spaces between the notes are just as important as the notes themselves." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in ways that neither of them was accustomed to in their carefully constructed adult lives. Daniel shifted Lena's weight in his arms, studying Evelyn's face in the dim lighting that remained after the concert's conclusion. "I stopped playing for 7 years," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "After Sarah died, after Lena lost her hearing, I thought music was something that belonged to my past, something I had to sacrifice in order to be the father she needed. I convinced myself that art was a luxury I couldn't afford, that practical concerns had to take priority over creative expression." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion as he continued. "But watching her tonight, seeing how she experiences sound through touch and vibration, seeing how other children like her responded to music in ways I never imagined possible, I realized I wasn't honoring Sarah's memory by staying silent. I was dishonoring it. You gave me permission to remember who I used to be," Daniel continued, his eyes meeting Evelyn's with an intensity that made her heart race. But more importantly, you helped me discover who I could become. Not just a father struggling to provide for his daughter. Not just a former musician living in the past, but someone who could use his gifts to build bridges between different worlds. Lena stirred in her father's arms, her eyes opening to focus on Evelyn with the clarity that children often possess when they're emerging from sleep but not yet fully awakened to the complexities of adult conversation. Through drowsy sign language, she asked a question that made both adults freeze in place. Their careful navigation of emotional territory suddenly interrupted by the kind of innocent directness that only children can manage. "Is Miss Evelyn going to be my new mommy?" The inquiry hung in the air between them, neither having fully acknowledged where their growing connection might lead, neither having discussed the practical realities of merging lives that had been shaped by vastly different circumstances and expectations. Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment at his daughter's blunt question, but Evelyn knelt down to Lena's eye level, her hands forming careful signs, as she responded with the honesty she had learned was the only appropriate currency in conversations with this remarkable child. "Would you like that?" Lena nodded solemnly, her expression serious as she considered the implications of such a dramatic change in their family structure. Then, with the wisdom that often accompanies early loss and the resulting emotional maturity, she added something that brought fresh tears to both adults' eyes. "Daddy needs someone to help him remember how to smile when he's not playing music." 18 months later, the ninth-floor piano had become the heart of something beautiful and unexpected, a symbol of transformation that extended far beyond the three lives it had originally brought together. Every Thursday evening, Henderson Media Towers Auditorium hosted Silent Symphonies, a concert series designed for hearing-impaired audiences that had gained national attention and inspired similar programs in cities across the country. Music therapy programs were citing the initiative as a model for inclusive performance, while educators were developing curricula that incorporated tactile music experiences for students with various learning differences and physical challenges. What had begun as an impulsive challenge from a lonely CEO to a mysterious custodian had evolved into a movement that was changing how people thought about accessibility and the universal human need for artistic connection. Daniel had resigned from his custodial position to become the program's full-time musical director, his days now filled with lesson planning, performance preparation, and collaboration with therapists and educators who specialized in adaptive music instruction. But more importantly, he had learned to balance his roles as father, partner, and artist, without sacrificing any essential part of himself. The community center piano, where he had first rediscovered his love of music, now sat in their living room, donated by Miguel when the center received funding for a new instrument. On quiet Sunday mornings, the house would fill with imperfect but joyful sound as Daniel played. Lena sketched, and Evelyn worked through violin exercises on an instrument she had taken up after 25 years away from serious musical study. Evelyn kept the Steinway in her office, where it served as a daily reminder that the most important decisions in life often come disguised as casual remarks made during moments of vulnerability or whimsy. She had learned sign language fluently enough to conduct board meetings with Lena as her unofficial translator, a sight that never failed to amuse her business partners, and had actually improved her company's reputation for innovation and social responsibility. The three of them had created a family that looked nothing like traditional expectations, but functioned with a harmony that would have made Chopin himself proud of the way they had learned to blend their individual melodies into something greater than the sum of its parts. Their home was filled with music now, not just the kind that emerged from piano keys and violin strings, but the kind that grew from understanding, patience, and love that had learned to communicate in multiple languages. The drawing Lena had created on the night of their first concert together now hung framed behind Evelyn's desk, a child's interpretation of three figures standing beside a piano with musical notes floating around them like snowflakes or butterflies. Beneath the image, in Lena's careful handwriting, were the words that had become their family motto. Chopin made Mommy cry. Daddy made music live again. But it was Evelyn's quiet observation, spoken during one of their late-night practice sessions, when the three of them gathered around the piano to work through pieces that challenged each of their abilities in different ways, that truly captured what they had discovered together. I wasn't looking for a pianist. I was looking for someone who knows when not to play. In the spaces between the notes, in the silences that made music possible, they had discovered that love, like great art, was not about perfection but about presence, not about what was heard, but about what was felt, deeply and completely, in the chambers of the heart.